So much for joining us today for a very special episode and hopefully a broader series on Palestinian history. Um, so delighted that we have our guest today, Hasan Hammami, and he will be giving us um, a quick but hopefully glorious tour of the history of Palestine. So just before we get started with that, I just wanted to give you a quick, brief introduction about myself and the museum. So my name is Mohammed Al-Khatib. I am a volunteer with the museum. I've been with the museum since August of 2019 here in DC. And the museum itself opened, it's approaching its 1-year anniversary. I think we opened in June of 2019. So happy 1-year anniversary to the museum. We are located in Washington, DC. We are the foremost leading voice on Palestinian culture and Palestinian history, one of the institutions of Palestinian culture and history in the DC area. And so we are so grateful for your support and for coming out, for joining us today on this call. The museum was founded actually by Bshara Nassar. He is actually not here with us today, but he should be joining in a couple of weeks. So hopefully I could fill his very big shoes, but he's the founder of the museum. He's originally from Bethlehem in Palestine, and he came to the United States in 2011 and noticed that, DC was a hotspot or a cultural epicenter for museums and historical landmarks, and lots of stories were being told through these institutions. But the Palestinians lacked a voice in that regard. That has always been a struggle for us as Palestinians, finding our voice and finding an accepting voice here in the West. And Bshara, that was one of his major goals in founding this museum. So we're so grateful to have this space. We're so grateful for your support. And I'm not going to talk much longer, but real quick, I also want to introduce our amazing co-hosts. We have Abby Bergen, we have Miriam Chaponaire, and we also have Becca, who is she's actually the coordinator, the communications coordinator with the museum. So thank you. So today's topic is going to be about Palestine and history. This is actually our second episode with Hasan. Previously, Hasan joined us and talked more about his history, his personal story, which is absolutely fascinating. Hasan will be taking us today on a journey through ancient Palestine and to modern times. And he's also going to tell us a lot about himself too, which I think in and of itself deserves multiple episodes. But we will also, this is hopefully going to be the second of many episodes. So please stay tuned. Please follow us on Facebook and please go to our website. We will be providing links in our chat room so you can, to learn more about the museum, and to also just to remind you, we also have a virtual tour for those who are joining us for the first time. So please, do check that out. The virtual tour itself was created with a lot of love by our another wonderful volunteer, Amber Hurley, and with Steve, who is a cartographer and has been a tremendous asset to the museum. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Hasan. So welcome, Hasan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be back with you. Can you hear me and see my picture well, clearly? Good. I want to thank the Museum of the Palestinian People for this opportunity and the audience that was with us last month on the 15th of May and today's audience. My name is Hasan Hammami. I was born in Jaffa, Palestine in 1932. I'm closer to 88 years of age, past 87 now. So I was the son of Ahmed Hammami and Nafisa Shatila. I was the grandson of Shakir Hammami, who is my grandfather, the patriarch of our family, whose grave is still there. It had been vandalized in Jaffa. Every time I go to Jaffa, I visited. and it's been kind of rebuilt, put back together, and his wife, Sitti Abdelrahim. Her grave was vandalized and the parts kind of got destroyed. After episode 1 on May 15, many people said they wanted to hear more. So here I am. And they said they wanted to hear more about myself. Well, I'm going to be talking, but it's not about me. It's about the Palestinian people and our history. I am a Nakba survivor of 1948. What does that mean? I'm one of the people who lost their home, their roots, their everything. They didn't lose their roots, but their livelihood in 1948, when 3 out of 4 Palestinians who were not Jewish were actually evicted forcefully by 3 Jewish terrorist gangs, and 75% of all Palestinian territory illegally taken away. These members of all of these Jewish gangs were immigrants who came from Eastern Europe and Russia. They were well armed, they were well trained during World War II and afterwards, and they were well supported by the British government, even though they were fighting the British Mandate authorities. They forced us out of our country to take over a whole country with everything in it, its assets, its wealth, its roads, its post offices, its schools, hospitals, railways, airports, port, and banks, and every tree in it, and every living and all thing that was there. They were driven by the motto that they had, which was never again, meaning never again will they suffer the European anti-Semitism that they and their grandparents and great-grandparents had lived under for 2,000 years, including the pogroms throughout Eastern Europe, and the worst of all, the Holocaust. Which were all done by European countries, European regimes, in fact, mostly Christian, either, Catholic or Orthodox Greek or Russian churches. Essentially, they made a home for themselves, the Jewish people, which is what it's called, and for which a new law was named, the new nation state law of the Jewish people. By clearing out the Palestinians, most of the Palestinians, 70%. And they had been granted 54% of the Palestinian territory by the United Nations in a series of actions which essentially had not listened to the words of the world through the General Assembly of the United Nations, but made the decision in the Security Council, where Britain, France, China, and the United States and Russia had the majority votes, but essentially they also squeezed more votes from the non-permanent members by force and by bribery, and it was passed. And the United Nations Security Council essentially was the quote-unquote the legal act for dividing Palestine between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. In terms of law, you cannot give land and property away if you don't own it or you haven't given permission for it. The UN did not have it. So that's where I see it. By basic, simple law, it was totally illegal. Besides the Nakba, several members of my family and another 5% are also, of the Palestinian people, are also Nakba survivors. What is the Nakba? Let me explain. The Nakba survivors are the Palestinian people who survived the Six-Day War in June 1967, when Israel, with overwhelming force, took over the remaining 22% of Palestine. They had initially been given 54 by the UN. They raised it up to 78% through the war, mostly in 1948-49. And in the Nakba, they took over the next 22% of Palestine, meaning all that was called East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, plus the Sinai, which is Egyptian territory, the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory, and part of southern Lebanon. Those Nakba survivors include my sister Fadwa, who still lives in Jerusalem, and her children, Hind, her eldest daughter, Hind, who was at one point the president of a social educational international group for the Middle East. Walid, who just retired last year from a career with the United Nations Development Program and now lives with his wife in Amman, and Khawla Hasna, my niece, who lives now in Canada. And they also included my two eldest daughters, the next side, my family, Fawziya and Rima, who were 10 years old and 6 years old, who were at the time in a girls' boarding school, German boarding school in Jerusalem, while I and my wife were living in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. We sent them there because in the 1960s, there were no good schools for girls in Saudi Arabia. So we took the position that we wanted them not to be started with their life with any disadvantages. We put them in that school. And one morning, on the first day of the 6-day war, I was in my office very early in the morning. I was managing a factory in the business for Procter & Gamble, making detergents, Tide and Cheer, to keep Saudi Arabia clean. And I heard this jet, it was a MiG jet that was flying very low and landed in the airport, which was less than 2 kilometers away. I went back to the office, turned the radio on, found out that the war had started. And that by that time, all of the Egyptian Air Force, nearly all of the Egyptian Air Force, with the exception of a few planes, one of which came to Jeddah, all of the Syrian Air Force, all of the Jordanian Air Force had been destroyed in the previous wee hours of that morning. So I tried to reach the school. There were no telephones, no radio telephones, no telegram, no communications, no flights, no roads, everything was. And having been kind of, my wife was British, we used the British Embassy to find out about it. We used the American Embassy because the company I was leading was a partner of a large American corporation. And we used everywhere, including the Red Cross. And for 21 days, Barbara, my late wife, who died 13 years ago, and I did not know whether they were dead or alive. That was, that nearly destroyed my wife's life. So that's a précis of the next, particularly as it deals with me personally in my life. And as I look at our family after the Nakba and the Nakba, our family, my brothers and sisters, have been spread out throughout the world. They grew up, got married, or away from the city of Jaffa. Our society, our family, the city of Jaffa was a very integrated city with neighbors who were of every faith that you can imagine. There were Jews who had been living there for hundreds of years. There was in fact a Jewish member of the city council of Jaffa who was from a Jewish Palestinian family. There were Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. There were Roman Catholic, Western Catholics, Eastern Catholics, Church of England, Church of Scotland, and there were Muslims. And we lived close to one another. And our home, if I were to look north, east, south, and west, we were surrounded by a beautiful mix of people of different faiths. They were neighbors. Now, none of us are left in Jaffa. Only my sister Fadwa and my daughter Rima, my middle daughter, are in Jerusalem. And Fadwa is Samida, is staying put. Rima is a professor at Beirut University. She teaches women's legal studies as part of our cultural anthropology department, and has a PhD program which has been recognized quite as outstanding, east of Rome and west of Tokyo. Our family, when I think about my family, my eldest sister Nahida married Hafiz al-Barudi, who was an educated man from Khartoum. He was my best friend in Saudi Arabia when I was working as a translator for Aramco. My sister Faizi married Mamdouh Zakisha, who was a Palestinian from Jaffa, who fell in love with her when he was at school and she was at school, different schools. My sister Fatima, now Mamdouh has passed away. Faizi right now lives in Dubai with her son. Then my sister Fatima married Saeed Shatila, who comes from a family which was from Jaffa, but originally several generations ago from Beirut, and they live in Arizona. I live in Punta Gorda, recently lost my second wife, Elizabeth, who came from Canada and England, and whom I married 3 years after I lost my first wife, Barbara, who came from England. My brother Hussein married Silvana Bramsha in Egypt when he was a consul for the Jordanian government. And they now live in Amman. He served as a consul, as an ambassador for Jordan in Damascus, Morocco, Bonn, Washington, D.C., and other places. Silvana Bramsha comes from an Egyptian family with parentage of Italian and Assyrian Egyptian family. Who comes next? My sister Fatma married Suleiman Hasna, who comes from Jerusalem, from an old Jerusalem family. And my sister Layla, who's her twin, married an Austrian gentleman, and they didn't have a long life together, unfortunately. And my brother Mustafa married Maha Ashawali, who came from Palestine, from Jerusalem and the area around Jerusalem. And my youngest brother, Saeed Hammami, married Haya from Jordan. My extended family today includes Miles Hartley from England and Scotland, Alex Pollock from Glasgow in Scotland, Niels Boole from Denmark, Gordon Doig from Sydney, Australia, and the Young family in London, Ontario. We are spread out, but as you can see, we are citizens of the world, but also very well integrated with people of various countries, nationalities, and languages and backgrounds, which is essentially pretty much what is happening in a different way with the Palestinians in the diaspora. None of us live in Jaffa, and many of us would love to go back and live in. I can speak for myself. I would go tomorrow like this. However, I'm denied by Israel of a human right, a right that is part of the Charter of the United Nations, which is the right of return of refugees to their homes, denied that by the State of Israel. And it goes on. Now let's move to the subject at hand today. I want to make history not a dull subject, but something quite interesting. Before we do, let me clarify the formation of I call the group of events and things that Israel and Zionist leadership have chosen to do to cover up for the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people, against the Palestinian Arabs. I want to distinguish because there are Palestinian Jewish Arabs, which were probably somewhere in the range of between 3 and 4.5% of the population of Palestine before the Nakba. And they now, their descendants, I met many of them several times. They live in a town outside of Nablus, and they live in a suburb of Jaffa, Tel Aviv, called Holon, which was started when I was a child as a colony. It was not called a colony. It was made up of all small white houses inhabited by Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe who didn't speak any Hebrew. They all spoke their different languages. They were still learning Hebrew, and they were part of the socialist system that Israel was started with. They developed a new history and propaganda to convince the world that Palestine was practically uninhabited. And they used the term a land without people for a people without a land. They've also spread out the claim that there was never a Palestine. So part of going through history is for the education of people who have heard that and have got through hearing it, accepted or maybe think that may be so, as well as others who don't know enough about the history. Others said Palestinian Arabs were nomads or semi-nomads without a culture or civilization, that the Palestinians had either a national identity, and some of them say their identity started only in 1967 when they started to claim Palestine, which they didn't have, and that they lacked the economic structure or roots in the land. Yet, the continuity of Palestinian roots in the land, in fact, go back to antiquity. Absorbing and outlasting various conquerors, Palestinians tenaciously tended their ancestral farmlands as freeholders or as tenants in some times, and more importantly, by the end of World War I, as unfettered freeholders of more than 97% of the land of Palestine. I'll read a paragraph from the study at a previous managing director of the Jewish National Fund had stated at the time. When the kingdom of Byzantium, which was Turkey, the Eastern Church, was subjugated by the Arabs, in other words, when Palestine was liberated from the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine emperor at the time decided to take over in his name and in the name of the Byzantine Empire all of the property in Palestine. The cities, the towns, the villages, the farms, the municipal authorities, the religious bodies, churches, monasteries, and other properties were the largest landholders who had expropriated the land for themselves. And yet the soil was cultivated by the Palestinian owners who had remained on the plots of land as tenant farmers. And similarly, people who lived in the small towns and villages theoretically did not own the homes they live in. Everything was the property of the Byzantine Empire. I want to add here that the Palestinian people have a long-time habit of welcoming the stranger, when the stranger comes in peace, comes to work, or comes for a pilgrimage, or comes to visit. This habit was developed over the centuries by a socio-cultural trait. The trait showed itself in the physical characteristics of Palestinians. You find Palestinians today who look like me or like Muhammad. Some have more hair, Muslims have more hair than I do, and they have hair which could be dark brown, black, blonde, even some red hair. One of the towns outside of Gaza called Jabalia, which is a big refugee camp today. The original people of Gaza, of Jabalia, are almost all blonde with honey-colored eyes, not hazel. Yes, right. And other towns in the north and other parts of Palestine have more, probably somewhere the remains of people who had come in for the pilgrimage, or the children of the Crusaders who had stayed in Palestine. Thus, the Palestinian farmers, village people, and city people who were exiled, forced out, and expelled by the Zionist organizations in 1948 are the indigenous people of Palestine, the descendants of the Philistines and the Canaanites and the Semitic people, they were all essentially Semitic, other Semitic tribes who lived in Palestine since before the time of the Philistines, the Canaanites, and their cousins, the Phoenicians. Successive group of newcomers, including those from Crete, Semites from Iraq, including the family of Abraham, our common patriarch, the patriarch of the Jews and Christians and Muslims, had essentially lived together. And I will go back earlier in history. A Palestinian writer from Jerusalem in 986, in the year 986, in the 10th century, enumerated the products that the society of the society in the 10th century had as agricultural products. Copious quantities, in his words, of prized fruits of every kind: olives, figs, grapes, quinces, plums, dates, walnuts, almonds, jujubes, and bananas, some for export, and as well others for processing, including sugar cane and indigo for dye, lye for making soap and buildings, and sumac and other mineral resources like chalk earth, which was the source of chalk, and marble, sulfur, salt, bitumen from the Dead Sea, and stone, rocky stone, different kinds of stone, not just sandstone used for building city walls and other homes. As for the earlier times, from the Stone Age on to the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, visit any museum in the world, in the large museum in the world, including the British Museum in London, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, DC, or any museums in France or Germany or Italy, and you will find physical historic records, including statuettes, shards of pottery, complete pieces of pottery and dishes and things to cook with, and carved stones as well, which have been dug up in the past 150 years of excavations. The interest in doing excavations in Palestine started in the late 1800s by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which essentially was the empire that was based both in Vienna and Budapest and ruled almost all of Central and Eastern Europe up to the borders with the Ottoman Empire. Including the very old and very eclectic museum called the Palestine Museum, which was founded by the Rockefeller Foundation in East Jerusalem, founded well before the establishment of Israel, that I've seen many times. I've taken my kids when they were 5 and 6 years of age. One example is a group of 4 rooms in the British Museum, and when the webcast recording is shown on the Facebook, it will show the web link to that British Museum. Also, another one is a study by a person by the name of George McCurdy. I just picked a few from here and there, from the American Philosophical Society, written in 1936. And there you will find, again, on the web link, its web link once this is recorded in the next few days. I leap here to recent history. The claims that Israel and Zionist leaders and their friends declaring that there was never a country called Palestine. Well, this claim is as far away from the truth as propaganda and modern PR can be in reinventing history. But then essentially after three generations of Israelis being educated this way, they take it for granted that this is the truth. There was no such thing as Palestine. There were just nomads who came from Arabia and they went there. In 1919, actually, the Palestinian people were provisionally recognized as an independent nation by the League of Nations. Let me repeat it. Were provisionally recognized as an independent nation by the League of Nations in its covenant article number 22, sub number 4, as well as the 1922 mandate for Palestine that Britain had invented, written for itself, and had the League of Nations vote and approve it. They wrote it this way because at that time, the British people were sick of wars and they did not want to see more colonies added in different places. So Britain composed for himself and arranged in that mandate document, which they called First Class, that its purpose was to help the Palestinian people over a period of 10 years, at the end of which they will be able to rule themselves and govern themselves and have their own state. Of course, that's the last thing that they had in mind, because they had other things in mind, and we'll get to that. In reality, they wanted those 10 years to give themselves the time and arrangement and the time to negotiate and gradually sell the idea of a Jewish home in Palestine for the Jews of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And in fact, in a move from a dream of a home for themselves and in the Holy Land to a significant advancement of less than 50 years, the Jewish elites working both in England with the House of Lords, with the House of Commons, which is the Parliament, with Lord Rothschild and the Rothschild Bank and the British government, members of all of the members of the House of Lords also, they had moved from a dream of having this land in Palestine through 5 steps in less than 50 years to lay down the basics for that. Let me take those 5 steps. Some of you may know about it. I suspect very little do. The first step was a British plan, which was initiated first under Prime Minister Disraeli, who was Queen Victoria's favorite prime minister in 1876. 1876. In 1876, the Russian Empire under the Tsar Nicholas II, with urging of the Russian Orthodox Church, declared war on the Ottoman Empire to take Istanbul back and return it to its original Russian Orthodox Church self as Constantinople, and take large parts of the Ottoman Empire in southern Russia. The Israeli and the British Empire obviously did not want this to happen because they were looking at Turkey, Ottoman Empire, as the sick man of Europe, like other parts of Western Europe, Western world. They all wanted some parts of the Ottoman Empire to themselves. So Disraeli first organized this conference and to try and resolve these things through peaceful means. Russia objected, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire objected because they both wanted some parts of Russia, of the Ottoman Empire. So he arranged for the Royal Navy in force, with a great force, to go to Turkey, to the Dardanelles, and actually attack and destroy the Russian Navy. So to help, in their view, to help Russia, to help the Ottoman Empire. Against this, when he came back to London and his first meeting after Queen Victoria, he said to her, you know, we killed 4 birds with 1 stone in this thing. We destroyed the Russian Navy and stopped the Russian plans to take over parts of the Ottoman Empire. We took Cyprus from Turkey, sorry. They took Cyprus from Turkey as a prize for helping defend. That was when Britain took the very first significant part of the Ottoman Empire. We stopped the Austro-Hungarian Empire from creeping and taking over parts of the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe. And we got word from the Ottoman Empire, from the High Gate, it was called, to allow a number, unlimited small number of Jews to go to Palestine as to live in Palestine. This brings me this story, which is personal, which is kind of interesting. Until I started doing the research for this presentation, I wasn't even aware of this event that was kind of masterminded by the Israeli, who was a brilliant politician, and essentially had to skate on very thin ice through the deep anti-Semitism that existed in England, because it was there as well. My great aunt in Darwish, this gets into a very interesting part of history. In Darwish, Auntie in Darwish, who was my mother's great aunt, lived till age 114. She survived to be 114 years old. In the latter, maybe 2 decades, she got nearly deaf and nearly blind, but very alive in her brain and memory were fantastic. And as kids, she would sit with us and tell us stories about the Russo-Japanese War and the Russian invasion of Turkey. And it had not occurred to me until I was doing this research on for this lecture, that some of the things she was telling us were happening at that time. In fact, when Russia was trying to invade Istanbul, take over Turkey, the Turks were in a panic. They essentially took out from all of the countries in the Middle East near to them, from Palestine specifically, I mentioned, all the dry goods that they could get, all the dry food, dry beans and hummus and other things, all the dry rice and anahan, and as much cattle, mostly goats, as much timber. They actually cut down significant large numbers of forests to take the timber essentially to feed its people during this war. And there was what was then kind of referred to as a majaa, as a famine in Palestine. On top of that, they were actually going into small towns and big cities and finding healthy young Palestinians whom they would actually take out and circumscribe. They put them in the Turkish army. And people were actually starting to hide their young because, once they were gone, firstly, they were treated like dirt. But so it's kind of interesting how the history of what was happening at that time also related to what I learned as a kid from my great aunt. Second one of these steps was in 1907 when Prime Minister Henry Campbell Bannerman, who was supposedly an independent, he was a Scotsman, had been looking at, again, like most Western countries, what to do with the properties of the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and also how to continue to defend and protect and supply the British Empire, which spanned all corners of the world. And he organized a commission, which was acting on the words that Britain was increasingly alarmed with the growing Arab awakening in the first part of the 20th century, emerging in the context of Arab indigenous nationalism, and that's their words, interfering with the growth and defense of the British Empire, including running the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy on coal, which is very impractical, protecting the Suez Canal and access to the newly discovered oil fields in the Middle East. The answer Bannerman received from the commission was kind of very interesting. And I'll summarize it this way. The report came up to him and said, we need to develop a policy and implement it, and that is to promote disintegration, division and separation in the region between all the Arab regions and states to establish artificial political entities that would be under the authority of the imperial countries. And that included, like, for instance, Morocco under France, Libya under Italy, Tunisia and Algeria under France, Egypt under Britain, Palestine under Britain, etc., etc. And taking to fight any kind of unity, whether intellectual, religious, or historical, and taking practical measures to divide the region's inhabitants so we can divide them and rule them. And to achieve this, it was proposed that they have a buffer state, that's the term they used, a buffer state, that it be established in Palestine, populated by a strong foreign presence which would be hostile to its neighbors and friendly to European countries and their interests. This buffer state in Noah's report was referred to as a buffer state, but in later discussions, when it was records were open, it was essentially the state, the Jewish state, which would solve the Jewish problem in Eastern and Western Europe. Now, the third step of this is in 1914, when Britain enlisted the Arabs in fighting the Ottoman Turks and promised them that they would have their independence, with Britain and France who were helping them. The Allies would remove the Ottomans and give the Arabs a chance to have their own states. And they enlisted what were called Arab armies, firstly in the area in Hijaz and in the area of southern Palestine and Jordan with the Hashemite monarchies, and Saudi Arabia with the first establishment of the House of Saud, who essentially forced the Ottomans out. In 1916, just 2 years after the start of the First World War, Herbert Samuel, who later became Sir Herbert Samuel, a member of the British Defense Cabinet and also a member of the Zionist Organization of Britain, and later became Sir Herbert Samuel, wrote a memorandum establishing a policy for Palestine to be set in motion immediately that Britain wins the war against Turkey. Not long after that, actually, Herbert Samuel himself was appointed as the High Commissioner for Palestine, and moved into Palestine from Jordan at the head of a very small group of British soldiers with a large number of Arab army soldiers aided by them, and went there essentially to set out what they had planned. In 1922, the last step of this was the development by Britain, which was sanctified, approved by the Western countries in the League of Nations, to grant Britain the British mandate over Palestine, and that fit with a bigger plan, which was the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide up the rest of the Middle East between France, Britain, and some parts of Italy. Several times in the 1920s and 1936, the Palestinians resorted to rebellion, armed resistance, when Palestine and the British were in Palestine, and the British responded by crushing them. During World War II, in fact, in 1936, almost the whole of the old city of Jaffa, a good part of the old city of Jerusalem, and many small Palestinian towns were actually leveled when there was this uprising against the British Empire. But then, as we shouldn't stop to this history, we can go back much earlier history about Palestine and the Palestinians. Palestine is a meeting place for three great land masses: the European landmass, the Asian landmass, and the African landmass. And it might well have been made, Palestine might have been well made to be used as a route from other regions to Africa by way of Palestine. Europe had no direct bridge to Africa, not anywhere close by. So the only land bridge between Europe as well as Asia to Africa went through Palestine and part of northeastern Egypt. Even as early as the lower Pleistocene period, which is the period before the Stone Age, yet before the Stone Age, man had developed both physically and culturally as Homo sapiens to a point where man's oldest primitive society were all found on the periphery of the Euro-Asiatic landmass, including Palestine. I'm going to jump here. In 1925 onwards, after the end of World War I, several archaeological teams carried out great digs in several parts of Palestine. Turville Peter from the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, they started the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, and later another American School of Archaeology of Prehistoric Research, found in Robbers Cave near the Sea of Galilee, and Wadi al-Mughara and other sites in central Palestine, as well as, I'll name some of them, 5 or 6 different significant digs where they found remains of human beings as far back as the beginning of the Stone Age. Most of these, and they were essentially a group of 7 sites, 11 sites, more or less complete skeletons of the Neanderthal man and fragments as well as remains of groups, meaning the earliest form of family society in these caves and in these wadis of communal living. Most of these were embedded in hard, what's called breccia, which is a mix of clay and sand that from one layer of one age to another, they built one over the other. They were removed in blocks and enveloping breccia to London, where the task of cleaning had been successfully carried out by Mr. McGowan of the American School of Ancient Archaeology. Under the supervision of the Royal College of Surgeons. In here, I'm making quite a point of it because in these, including Mugharat al-Kabara, they also founded layers that were as high as 70 feet of different layers of civilization that started from few people to bigger groups of people to more advanced groups of people. And in one of the tops of them, the skeletons that were found were associated with industrial remains. They called it industrial remains in Mugharat al-Wad, the cave of the valley, and Mugharat al-Kabara. That they found people who had a long-headed stature, long legs, and relatively short arms by comparison with later generations, but they had handmade tools, which they took pride in the carved bone haftings of sickle blades. You know how a sickle has a blade. I hope you can see my image, has a blade. And they were made into saws and of bone. And that was essentially before the Bronze Age. And very interestingly, a rich yield of cultural remains from these 3 caves and Mugharat al-Wad and al-Tabun. The culture-bearing deposits of Mugharat al-Tabun with layer upon layer of deposits to a thickness of 21 meters, 70 feet, gave evidence gradually of a developing, settled communal living. So they started living as a community. And the people who then moved on were the kind of the early grandparents of the people who were the Canaanites as they grew up and started building towns, villages and towns and so on. So the significance of this evidence settled communal living in Palestine, the land of Canaan, starting about 10,000 years ago and growing in community size and skills till 4,000 years ago, from 10,000 to 4,000 years ago, overlapping with the start of the Bronze Age between 5,000 years ago and 3,000 years ago. And within that, try to remember these times, Abraham, our patriarch, and his family arrived in Palestine 3,600 years ago, i.e. near the end of the Bronze Age. In other words, in the beginning of the Bronze Age, there was a society there living in towns, villages, and they were tending land and growing and had animals.
Hasan, I had a quick question actually with regards to this because I want to kick off the Q&A. How should Palestinians today, how should they associate with their Canaanite history? Like, the Lebanese, they frequently, they mention, they glorify their Phoenician history. As Palestinians, what role should our Canaanite past have in shaping Palestinian history?
The Canaanites were only one part of the Palestinian history, and the other part were the Philistines.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, we're not talking about pure races. There is no such thing as
yeah.
One talks about a pure race has something screwed, some screw missing out there.
Mm-hmm.
The Palestinians essentially need to understand their history in the way that essentially the land of Canaan was a welcoming land, firstly because of its important access from the ancient trade routes and access between Western Asia and Europe and Africa. And also because it was the Mahd, the home base, the home bed of the three great religions, the three Abrahamic religions, which essentially joined there and had welcomed people from different parts of the world, where there were minorities in Palestine when I was alive, who were from Armenia, friends of mine, who were from Morocco. Many Jews in Palestine had come from Morocco, who were from Greece, and the ones from Greece, separate from the invasion by Alexander the Great to invade the Pharaonic Empire, had moved and lived in the area around Gaza and Mert al-Asqalan, Ashkelon.
Mm-hmm.
They formed, essentially at one point, they formed their own army that chased the pharaohs out of southern Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Palestine did not have a great navy like, they were not naval like the Phoenicians.
The Phoenicians, yeah.
However, they were rich in culture and rich in the richness of culture that comes with the three great religions.
Mm-hmm.
Not only has meaning to people who are Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but also has meaning in the basic rules of these three religions, which is do good, don't do bad, don't kill, don't hate, etc. And that richness, I think, is sometimes not as easy to associate in the world of Hollywood wars and armies and all that.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked this question is because, the Palestinian cause or Palestine is firmly rooted in pan-Arab nationalism. I mean, when we came about, we were the darling of the pan-Arabist cause, but at the same time, I feel like that in turn diluted our connection, our ancient connection to Palestine, as Canaanites. And this kind of helped kind of reinforce, you know, Zionist claims that we are just this recent modern construct, as opposed to being this, you know, the latest iteration of this very ancient people, you know. So
as I said, the conclusion from those ancient digs from the Stone Age and the Bronze Age indicated that there were Palestinians who actually started communal living and were living gradually got up. And before Abraham and his family had essentially migrated from Ur in Babylonia in modern Iraq, ancient Iraq, and settled for a few years there, but didn't stay too long because he ultimately wanted to go to Egypt. But the reality of Palestinian history is because of its location and its people and its mix of people. It was for a long time at the height of the human development pyramid, I might say. Level of education, advancement, development, social development, business development, and so on. To give you an example, Jaffa, which is a city of 100,000, the greater Jaffa metropolitan area was about 125,000 before it was destroyed, had 3 daily newspapers, had 4 cinemas, had three foreign endowed hospitals and 3 local hospitals. Had a society that brought in musicians and artists and politicians and so on, and were there and did not achieve all of that through wars, it achieved it through human development. It's a small country. I mean, there are other small countries in the world that have achieved success through human development without wars, and you can see them in modern times, whether it's Singapore or Luxembourg or Monte Carlo. But it's a bigger picture.
So we do have a couple of other questions, if you don't mind, Hasan. Abby, can you? And I know that also Samad had her hand up, so I'm gonna unmute you, Samad, if that's okay, and you can ask your question.
Good.
All right, so
give me the question.
I think
from Samar Dodar.
Okay, it's okay. We can just move on to Greg's question. He says, as you may know, there is a new movement among substantial populations of Jewish people that have a greater understanding and new empathy for the Palestinian people. However, many on all sides now recognize that there are 2 people there, neither of which can be denied. If you had your Druthers, given where we are now, how would you have the political situation settled?
You know, we are in the 21st century. In the 21st century, there are only 2 countries in the world today, which are states that are based on citizenship and religion at the same time, and that is Saudi Arabia and Israel. And you know, this used to be the case in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century in Western Europe and many other countries. To consider that the only way to do this is to separate people and build states based on religion, when religion is only one element of the human mind and human being and culture, and is important, but you might say the hijacking of religion as a way to build a state, which was essentially what Saudi Arabia has done. This is what, when Israel first started, it was started as a socialist country. But after the Six-Day War in 1967, a huge religious movement took the whole thing and turned it into much more important, a Jewish religion, religious ethnic group, whereas it's, you know, the Jews are a people who come from different ethnicities and different races and different parts of the world. And you can't make them all as one people, as if they are one race now, one ethnicity, and also speak for all the Jews of the world. In any way, the fact I go to my own heart, the only thing that makes sense, whether this happens, and probably will happen in time, hopefully in my life, maybe not, at the tipping point, we need to move to a single democratic state where there is complete separation of state from church, temple, and mosque, where complete recognition and respect of church, mosque, and temple, and also where there are no preferences as a result of ethnicity, where it's democracy, where everyone is subject to the same rights and privileges and duties. This is, in some ways, a short period of time between the end of the Ottoman Empire and the 1948 war. The country that I lived in, Palestine at that time, the city, the school I went to, the places I knew, essentially were one country where there was really, in the law, there was no difference between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, whether people who came originally from Afghanistan or Italy or Greece are different from the Jews who came from Europe. I think ultimately, whether this one way or another, whether it's going to happen through more wars or through whatever, when man gets sick of wars and really leans towards a tipping point of human rights and equality, at that point, that's the only thing that will ultimately work. Yeah. Stop this whole craziness, which is actually driving the world into World War III, where essentially the heart and mind of the extreme Zionists among the Zionist movement essentially are working to set up World War III as a war between the Western world and Islam. In that, there are some crazies in Christianity who also tie that up with the return of Christ.
I mean, there are crazies everywhere. There's no doubt. We just have to make sure those voices don't, So Samad, I think we're ready for you. I'm so sorry. So I'm just going to ask you to unmute, and please feel free to ask your question. And sorry, okay, guys, I know we're going over a little, but bear with us. There's a lot to unpack.
It's a big subject, but yeah, whatever we can cover today, we can cover it.
Yeah.
But I wanted really to bring the subject of this ancient history, which is a history that essentially denies, erases all of the claims that they were Bedouins, they were nomads, they were none at all, they didn't have the right, they didn't have all of that stuff. And the interesting thing is that this dream was the result of terrible anti-Semitism and driving the European countries to actually be rid of the Jewish minorities in Poland and Germany and southern Russia and in Russia. It was so when there was strong support for the formation of Israel, Soviet Union, as well as the United States and Britain and France, voted for creating this part of Palestine for only a few years before, less than 10 years before, in the conference of Evian, when Roosevelt invited all Western states to develop agreement on who would take how many Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria and other places. The United States said, we will take 10,000, we don't want any more. Canada said they will take 10,000, and as long as they go into the inside provinces.
Well, let's,
10,000 on condition they become Catholic. So you can see the depth of how anti-Semitism could not have moved from that kind of anti-Semitism in less than 10 years to 1947, 48, decided to
Yeah. So let's, sorry, Hasan, let's have Samar ask her question and then we can, sorry, I'm sorry,
Okay.
So,
no, it's okay. Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Samar, yes.
yes, we can.
Okay. I'm an Egyptian woman, and my mother is Palestinian. And I'm working on a project, oral history project, based on the letters of my grandfather. His name is Ali Rashid Shah, and he's from Gaza, but he lived in many cities in Palestine. And his letters covers this area from 1926 till 1967 when he passed away.
Yes.
He lived a while in Jaffa when he was the headmaster of the school, Al-Amiriya school. And okay, now what I would like to know if you lived in Jaffa and for how long and which time, which years, because I'm really interested in knowing more about the everyday life and the society and families and people living in Jaffa during his life.
Let me have a go. I was born in 1932 and I left in end of 1932 and left in the middle of 1948. I was 15 years old when I left.
Great.
At the time were students at the Al-Amiriya school that your father was.
Where?
Yes. One of them. Excuse me.
So my grandfather left Palestine, left Jaffa, 1947.
Wow.
And he went to Egypt. He had like a career shift because he couldn't, he had to resign and leave his, beloved job as a educator and as a headmaster of schools in Palestine because of, students were protesting and they were marching, and the representative of the English mandate asked him to expel those students. So he refused, and then he had to resign because, of his views about how to defend his country. Anyway, so he left 1947. So if you have time, maybe later, not during this session, and you don't mind if I send you email or we can talk, because I would like to hear more about your, being as a student or just a teenager in Jaffa during these days. So do you know my grandfather?
Yeah, Samad, I should also say, we also, on our Facebook page, we do have the pre-recording of our previous session with Hasan, and he did talk a lot about his life during that time. I also encourage you to check it, but definitely you guys should connect. And
yes, but last question, did he know? Did he meet my grandfather?
I don't know.
I don't think so. I was in my last year.
Okay.
Hasan was too busy studying.
Yeah.
I was in one school, the Flair School, which was a French missionary school, even though I'm a Muslim. But at school, we had a group of students who organized ourselves as the Arab Academy. There was a French academy in that school, and we joined with other students, including students of Al-Amiriya.
Okay.
That's great. So, guys, we have to end it here. We are 15 minutes. I know that, I would easily spend another hour, but we have to be mindful of people's time. Thank you so much for joining. We will have a recording of this up on our Facebook page. Please consider supporting us. I've provided a link to our website so you can donate or show your support, or if you're interested in volunteering, we're looking for volunteers because we're going to be opening up soon, hopefully in the next couple of months. But don't quote me on that because Prada will have more clarity. We are also going to be, this is not going to be our last conversation with Hasan. We're going to have more. So please stay tuned. And we definitely look forward to seeing more of you here soon. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Hasan. You've been amazing as always. And Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
We
Muhammad.
can end the
Thank
meeting.
you for the audience. I promise you,
Yeah.
as long as there is an audience who's interested and with questions, I will do my best to give you the best I can do.
Yeah.
I am not a historian. I'm a student of history. I revolt against history that has been written by the winners of wars.
Exactly.
Because essentially, all they do is they justify all of the things they've done in those wars. And that you have to listen to history from the ears and the hearts and the mouths of the people who lived in those wars, who suffered those wars, who can move away from the pain and think clearly and hopefully wish for a better world for everyone.
With for everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Hasan. Excellent closing words. Have a good day, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Muhammad.